I was standing in my Chicago kitchen with the sink running and my hands still wet when the sentence that changed everything landed with a dull thud. "Stop whining, it's already sold." My son Mike leaned against my counter as if he owned the room arms, crossed over a new watch that glowed like a dare. The coffee mug that still smelled like Frank trembled in my grip as I tried to understand how a child raised on double shifts and hand-me-down miracles could shrug off stealing his father's 1978 Rolex Submariner and trade it for pizza money before a trip to Italy. He called it just a watch. 6 months after burying the man I loved for 43 years, the ritual that tethered me to him winding his watch each morning while the coffee brewed was gone. Ashley, my daughter-in-law, chimed in with the lazy compassion of someone who thinks therapy is a crowbar to pry open other people's lives. "Clinging to material things isn't healthy, Dorothy." I swallowed the words. She had no right to speak about what Frank would want, and asked, "Which pawn shop?" "Golden State Pawn on Milwaukee Avenue," Mike said. "They gave me $800. I told him the watch was worth at least $3,000 and got a snort in return. What they did not understand was that some objects are not containers for money, but for time, breath, promise. When the door shut behind them and the house exhaled its new heavy silence, I realized I had a choice between surrender and planning. 40 years as a bank manager had taught me the difference. The pawn shop sagged under fluorescent lights that made every second-hand object look seasick. A tattooed clerk with a weary face, his name tag read. Danny spotted my grief before I reached the counter and said he had already heard from my son. "Business is business, lady. Fair market value." I offered to buy the watch back, and he said the words that buckled my knees, "It's already sold." But he lowered his voice and brought out a small manila envelope, explaining that during cleanup, they had found a very professional hidden compartment in the back of the watch and tucked what was inside into this packet. The paper inside was yellowed and careful. Frank's handwriting steady as a metronome. Dorothy's birthday, July 15th, 1955. The day I knew I'd marry her, followed by a string of letters and numbers. SS4457, CH0815DS. I didn't recognize it yet. Something about the logic of it nagged in the way a missing stair nags your ankle. When I asked about the buyer, Danny grimaced, paid cash, no name. But when he'd mentioned the discovery, the man's interest sharpened like a blade. Someone had targeted Frank's watch. I carried the envelope home as if it were heat. At Frank's desk, surrounded by decades of file folders stacked like sedimentary layers of a shared life, I realized I had spent months looking for closure when what I needed was curiosity. My son called to accuse me of making a scene, then shifted into sudden interest when I mentioned the hidden note. I gave him nothing, because what had once been a boy's voice asking for help now sounded like a lockpick. I turned back to the paper and began looking for pattern rather than match. SS could have been Social Security, but the numbers did not align. CH could have been Chicago. 0815 was our August 15th wedding anniversary. DS were my initials. I thought of Swiss banks and offshore custodians and Frank's meticulous caution, and then I found a discreet firm called Secure Solutions Investment Management based in the Cayman Islands. The login page demanded a client number. My hands shook as I typed SS4457CH0815DS. Valid account number, the browser confirmed. The password took longer. Our wedding date failed, our address failed, my actual birthday failed. Then I remembered the note, not my birth date, but the July 15th he called the day he knew he'd marry me, the summer dance in Millennium Park. I typed 071555. Access granted flashed across the screen like thunder. The number that followed burned itself into my vision. Current account balance $2,800,000 and change. For a long time, I could only stare, replaying years of clipping coupons, patching work shirts, and making casseroles stretch across weeks, while the man I loved had kept a fortune in a private vault. The first wave was rage clean and hot. The second was the accountant in me methodical. I opened the history. The earliest deposit was 1982, 3 years after Mike was born, $5,000 labeled initial inheritance investment. Frank had never said a word about an inheritance beyond the modest sum that paid off our mortgage. For decades, the deposits were small and regular, the kind of discipline I recognized in the corners of our grocery lists, and then, in 2008, they leapt $10,000, $20,000 repeated and annotated with real estate liquidation, Chicago properties. He had been buying and selling buildings I never knew existed. In the account's secure messages, I found a folder labeled for Dorothy Emergency Access, only with a video dated 3 months before he died. At 12:00 a.m. in the quiet that has its own temperature, I clicked play, and Frank's face filled the screen, older and more tired than the version I allowed myself to remember. "If you're watching this, I'm gone and something has gone wrong," he said, with that steady voice that had anchored our storms. "The money isn't mine, sweetheart. It was my father's hidden before he died in 1981. And he made me promise to keep it secret and use it only if our family was in real danger." He spoke about investing cautiously, documenting everything, building legal protections, and hoping I would never need to open the account. That hope snagged on me. If this was insurance, then against what he had died of a sudden heart attack at work, no forewarning, no pattern of illness, yet he had been preparing. That contradiction scraped at my ribs like a message I had not learned to read. By morning, I had called in sick to my part-time job at the library, brewed coffee, and started following the thread through public records. The last deposit had been just 2 weeks before he died, $25,000, marked property sale emergency liquidation. Frank had been converting assets to cash, which meant pressure or threat or both. The titles and deeds showed a quiet parade of buildings, 2 flats and corner stores, and small warehouses sold in a tightening circle to a single buyer, Sullivan Investments, LLC. I called my nephew Danny, who works in real estate, and asked him to trace the company. While he combed records, I dug deeper in Frank's files and found misfiled in a manila folder labeled insurance policies, a letter from a private investigator dated 6 months before Frank's death. The words were clinical and devastating. "Your son has accumulated approximately $180,000 in gambling debts to offshore betting sites. He has taken out high-interest loans using fraudulent income statements. He has consulted multiple attorneys about contesting wills and power of attorney options, and appears to be preparing to have you declared incompetent." I was still processing the nausea that accompanies clarity when my phone rang, and Danny confirmed what I already knew in my bones: Sullivan Investments, LLC belongs to Mike. In that instant, the account ceased to be a hoard and became a shield. Frank had not hidden money from me. He had hidden it from our son. When Mike and Ashley let themselves in with the key she had insisted on keeping after the funeral, I flipped the laptop screen down and slid the investigator's report under a stack of tax returns. They came dressed for a vacation. They did not deserve Ashley's sunglasses broadcasting price. They claimed they had just stopped by to say goodbye before an early flight, but their eyes skimmed my desk like searchlights. I told them I had found an odd investment account, nothing major perhaps, a few $1,000s, and watched their bodies stiffen in unison. They offered to help me make sense of the paperwork, and I declined with a smile sharpened by knowledge, explaining that I had already scheduled time with Frank's old accounting firm at $300 an hour. Mike argued against the cost with the kind of urgency people reserve for self-interest. Ashley's tone turned syrupy and then brittle. I asked Mike how the code from the watch had become his business, and he demanded to see the numbers. "What numbers?" Ashley snapped until Mike's glance hushed her. I let the silence stretch and then named their company and the debts and the offshore accounts and the lawyers and the plan to declare me incompetent, and I watched the blood drain from the faces of 2 people who had underestimated the woman who raised one of them and tolerated the other. They left with a hissed, "This isn't over," and I answered, that it had ended the day they decided I was worth more to them, helpless than whole. The house closed around me with the relief that follows a storm that did not topple the roof. 2 mornings later, at 8:00 a.m., the doorbell rang, and I found 2 attorneys in pressed suits on my stoop, Catherine Wells and David Kim, who announced they represented my son in family legal matters. They never asked to come in. I never invited them. Their smiles were professional and warm in that temperature-controlled way high-billing smiles are, and they explained they were here to ease my burden by arranging a temporary power of attorney so that Michael could manage any complicated finances while I grieved properly. It sounded like a script they had rehearsed for widows who still keep their own books. When I declined, they graduated to veiled threats suggesting that accessing offshore accounts and conducting international transactions without professional oversight could be construed as erratic behavior and lead to a competency petition. It would have terrified me a week earlier. Instead, I thanked them for their concern and closed the door as soon as the sentence ended. Then I dialed the number in Frank's files. Thomas Chen, the private investigator who had written the report, answered with the calm of a man whose business card is a parachute. He told me Frank had spent his final year assembling an airtight defense against exactly this play. Records affidavits audio captured legally inside our house photographs of meetings, a catalog of debts and fraud and manipulations. By the time we finished a late morning meeting in his downtown office, I understood that Frank had loved me in the grammar of systems. He had wired our house for sound-documented Ashley's whisper campaign about my supposed confusion, preserved Mike's words about nursing homes and inheriting sooner than later, and attached them to timelines and corroborating statements and bank ledgers. Evidence has a kind of gravity. You feel it settle when it becomes undeniable. Thomas slid a sealed envelope across his desk, with my name on it in Frank's precise hand. The letter inside apologized for secrecy, and then explained the origin of the money in a way that rethreaded the story I thought I knew. The original funds were his father's concealed after the long shadow of the Depression convinced him that families needed lifeboats. When Mike started boasting about inside deals and guaranteed flips, Frank had quietly positioned the inheritance to follow opportunities without ever exposing our household to risk. He had used our son's arrogance as a weather vane, then built protections so that any attempt by Mike to seize control would backfire into legal consequences. Frank wrote that he hoped mercy would be possible, but he would not demand it. He wanted me to have the choice, and he wanted me to be safe while choosing. My grief rearranged itself into something fiercer than sadness and cleaner than rage intention. With Thomas's guidance, I filed the evidence with the proper offices, including the state attorney's elder abuse unit and the agencies that handle banking and loan fraud. I had believed for months that widowhood meant learning to live with less. It turned out to mean refusing to live with less dignity. The call to the law firm representing Mike was short and polite. There would be no power of attorney. There would be a robust response to any baseless petition, and there would be additional filings if the whisper campaign persisted. The next morning, black SUVs with federal letters on the sides lined Mike and Ashley's curb, while agents in windbreakers carried boxes of files and hard drives into the daylight. The phone rang with Mike's number, and I listened to his panic without granting it a home in me. "You did this," he said, and I reminded him I had only told the truth and placed his own actions in rooms where truth is weighed. Ashley's voice came through harsh and perforated by fear. I recited for both of them the list of things I had learned: the debts, the fraudulent loan applications, the meetings with lawyers about declaring me incompetent, the recordings they had never realized were possible in a house they took for granted, the evidence that would feed a federal fraud inquiry and an IRS audit and a state case for elder abuse. Mike made a sound I recognized from scraped knees decades earlier, a wounded animal's question. I asked when he had decided his mother would be worth more to him dead than alive. A long silence is an answer. He confessed in the language of avoidance that around last Christmas, he had seen references to accounts he did not understand in Frank's office, and had begun to imagine a shortcut in which my death was a financial solution. He asked how much money Frank had hidden, and I replied with a sentence that felt like a line I was stepping across into a different life, enough to ensure I will never depend on anyone who believes I am a burden. I hung up and watched the agents finish their work. In Thomas's office 3 weeks later, as we organized the final stack of filings, his assistant announced a visitor named Richard Torres. A man in his 60s with the posture of a retired federal marshal stepped in carrying a blue velvet box that made my breath catch. He placed it on the desk and explained that he was the one who had purchased Frank's watch from the pawn shop, not because he collected vintage timepieces, but because he had been on quiet retainer for 2 decades to keep an eye on specific contingencies Frank feared might surface after his death. When the watch appeared at Golden State Pawn, he was notified and retrieved it so it could not be used as collateral by the wrong hands. He opened a second hidden compartment I had not known existed and slid out a micro SD card. He said Frank had recorded everything for 18 months audio in our kitchen, where private conversations turned into conspiracies video and photographs of meetings, cell phone captures of messages, ledgers that lined up with bank records, so that any challenge to my competency or right to assets would collapse under the weight of evidence. The folders that filled Thomas's screen were a cartographer's map of betrayal: dates, voices, plans, prices. Then Richard produced one more sealed envelope labeled Final Instructions, Dorothy's Protection Plan. The document inside detailed a series of irrevocable transfers that would trigger automatically. If Mike filed a competency petition, the Children's Hospital would receive all property owned by Sullivan Investments LLC in Mike's name. Every legal fee and cost would trace back to him personally, and his outstanding debts would be cross-assigned in a way that choked off the oxygen to schemes. Frank had built a humane trap, not to destroy a son, but to make sure he could not destroy me. I held the watch and felt not wealth or revenge, but structure. Frank had loved me in plans. The aftermath arrived in sequences that made sense to clerks and prosecutors and agents, but looked almost unreal in the soft light of my kitchen. Mike and Ashley's business was seized pending investigation. Audits unfurled. Subpoenas lifted the corners of rugs. Attorneys revised tones. Once fact replaced bluff. I chose not to attend the bail hearings or the grim early conferences where people who once smirked tried to look solemn, because watching consequences land is not the same as healing. Each day I wound the watch and reminded myself that protection is not paranoia when someone else has declared war on your peace. Neighbors called to apologize for the distance that Ashley had choreographed, with whispers about my memory. I accepted with grace because choosing peace is sometimes the sharpest rebuke. In the quiet hours, I opened Frank's video again and listened to the part where he said the money was meant for danger, not desire, and realized that he had been watching too. Not only Mike's schemes, but the slow erosion that happens to a widow when people decide she is a place to dump their fear of aging. He had built a wall that was also a bridge. Richard returned one afternoon with the watch serviced and gleaming and told me something I had not fully allowed myself to acknowledge. Frank's preparations were a love letter, written in statutes and account numbers. He had been a simple accountant to most people, worried about bills and modest about purchases, but in the last 2 years he had become a strategist who bent the systems of finance and law toward protection without ever crossing a line into cruelty. Thomas filed the final packets that ensured any renewed attempt to declare me incompetent would instantly trigger the charitable transfers Frank had authorized. We spoke with the hospital and structured a future gift that would carry Frank's name without ever giving Mike a lever to pull against it. I slept through the night for the first time since the funeral. When the federal agents returned to collect additional records, I brewed coffee for them and felt something uncoil. Gratitude arrives in odd places. The house began to feel like a home again, and not a stage where other people performed their intentions. Months later,
the prosecutor recommended a plea deal for Ashley and a sentencing recommendation for Mike that included federal prison time and restitution. The audits had revealed layers of misrepresentation that even sympathetic counsel could not excuse. Thomas texted me the dates and asked whether I wished to attend. I typed that I had better things to do, and I meant it. I visited the hospital wing that would one day carry Frank's name, and met with the development officer to make sure the gift would do the most good in the pediatric cardiac unit. I stood in the lobby and imagined the plaque, and thought about how grief can be compost, feeding what comes next if you turn it and tend it. The phone rang one evening and it was Mike, his voice suddenly young and threadbare. He asked for forgiveness without using the word, and I told him that forgiveness is something I will decide in the quiet, not on a schedule set by court dates.
"I do not hate you," I said, "because hate keeps you closer to me than your actions have earned. I choose peace." When I set the phone down, I realized my hands were steady. At 6:30 p.m. on a soft blue evening near the lake, my doorbell chimed, and through the peephole I saw a young woman with Mike's eyes and her own nervous courage. Melissa, my granddaughter, stood on the porch with a tentative smile and said she should have called first, but had wanted to come in person. We sat at my small kitchen table and she told me about her new job teaching second grade, about the engagement ring she kept twisting absent-mindedly, about the way Ashley had cut me out of the family story under the pretense of my supposed confusion. She apologized for the silence that was not truly hers to own, and I told her that agency sometimes begins with recognizing who has been writing your script. We talked about Frank and how he wore the watch every day, not out of vanity but out of habit. And I did not tell her about the compartments or the card, because the specifics were less important than the lesson. Some rituals are scaffolding. When she asked whether she should visit her father in prison, I told her that anger is a sign your compass still works, and that she could wait until a visit would not feel like self-betrayal. By the time she left, promising to come back every week and then making good on it, we had begun stitching a new fabric over the tear. I walked the neighborhood more. I joined 3 book clubs because each group reads as if the world depends on it. I volunteered twice a week at the hospital where nurses do a choreography you only see when you are still long enough to notice. I bought a small house that fit me and sunlight and the books we never stopped needing. The watch sat on my wrist, ticking like a companion, and sometimes I would catch myself touching it not to check the time but to thank it for being the vessel Frank had chosen for instructions and love. When reporters called after the sentencing to ask for comment, I declined, because narratives are nourishment, and I preferred to feed mine to people who would use it to build. The lawyer sent final letters, and the audits concluded, and the last piece of the whisper campaign dried up in the air like mist once the sun finds it. It is a strange thing to be 73 and learning to live forward rather than around other people's demands. But it is also a joy that feels like a second spring. The day the hospital installed the brass plaque, the Frank Sullivan Memorial Wing, funded by Dorothy Sullivan. I stood in the lobby and listened to the sound a building makes when it holds children's hope. I thought about the trap Frank had built that would have forced charitable transfers the minute Mike tried to take my name away from my decisions, and how I had chosen to make a gift anyway, not as punishment, but as a translation of his intentions into action. I texted Thomas that I would skip the hearing, because my calendar finally belonged to me. That night on my back porch, the lake reflecting a last stripe of light, I wound the watch and felt the familiar click resolve into quiet. The greatest love stories are not about fireworks, but about fortresses that keep out the wind so a small lamp can burn steady. Frank had spent 2 years building a fortress with doors I could open. There is a taste to betrayal. Metallic, like pennies on the tongue. But there is also a taste to reclaiming your life
and it is clean water after a long walk. In the months since the agents left with their boxes and the lawyers stopped calling and the last neighbor apologized, I have learned that protection is an active verb. I check the locks not out of fear, but out of respect for the home my husband and I made. I read contracts and ask follow-up questions and assume any demand for urgency is a disguise. I carry in my purse the letter Frank wrote and the smaller note from the day in July when he knew he would marry me. Because the sequence between those two papers is the story of a man who decided to love me not only with affection, but with foresight. When Melissa sits with me on Sundays and we cook and talk about the children she teaches, I tell her that memory is not a museum, but a workshop, and that every family inherits both tools and repairs. She asks if I will ever forgive her father, and I say that forgiveness is not the same as letting someone back into the room they tried to burn. Some doors are better as windows. People who followed my story online sometimes write to say they see their own lives in mine. The son who borrowed until borrowing became theft. The daughter-in-law who wore concern like costume jewelry. The widow treated like fog. I tell them to document everything, to build the paper bridges they may need to cross later, to recognize that boundaries are a kind of love you offer yourself when other people forget how to offer it to you. I tell them to find lawyers who understand both law and harm, to remember that calling something just a watch does not make it less of a lighthouse. I tell them that grief is not a timeline, it is a tide. It comes in and goes out and sometimes leaves gifts if you are willing to bend and look. When I turn out the kitchen light each night and the house settles, I feel Frank beside me in the structure of my days more than in the memory of his voice. Strength can be a routine. The lesson I carry is simple and hard-won. The people who love you will prepare you for the battles you do not even know are coming. And you can honor them best by living a life they protected, not a life reduced to the danger they feared. I was married to a man who hid account numbers in a watch so that his widow could have a compass. I am the woman who used it to walk out of a trap and into a morning where the lake looks like possibility. If this story steadied you, I would be grateful if you liked, shared, subscribed, and left a comment with the city you are watching from. Your voice matters, and you never know who will read it and feel less alone because you spoke.